book. So, as tends to be in a lot of these Sosonko books, it's not just about the subject itself. You also read about these other Soviet players and these other, world stars, not just Soviet players, just chess players in general. You read about their relationships, who was Smyslov friends with. There's a very interesting anecdote towards the end of the book where he talks about how he plays this blitz match with Mikhail Tal. So that's worth reading about, because that kind of, the score of that match surprised me. The Soviet chess school is interesting because I remember reading recently that Vishy Anand went on a tour of Moscow or something like this with a number of Indian chess players when he was much younger. And there was one guy on the tour who kept going on about how he wanted to see the Soviet chess school because he kept reading about Soviet chess school. And someone tried to explain to him that there was no such thing. There was no Soviet chess school. It was just a term. And apparently they just randomly picked out a building and showed him, look, this is a Soviet chess school, to try and, get him to shut up. So that was quite an amusing anecdote, I thought. But apparently, according to this I actually read it about this Boris Gelfand, but it was also very good. And Boris Gelfand said that it tended to be the case that people came from different areas and they looked up to certain players, they would idolise certain players and so on. Certainly think it'd be interesting if Sosonko wrote a book on someone like Kasparov or Karpov, but probably wasn't socially as close to those people. He happened to be socially close to people like Korchnoi, to Smyslov, to Bronstein. That's why he ended up writing books about them. Very good books. He's a brilliant writer. Whether he actually, I mentioned this before, is it possible that he paid them because he's primarily a journalist, I suppose? Also a very strong chess player, but it may just happen to be the case that because he was so erudite. It does seem a bit odd that these three very famous chess players happen to divulge so much of their life and their interests within this one person. So I just wonder whether there was some kind of journalistic impetus going on. Anyway, overall this is a very, very good book. And there are some photographs in the book as well. Let me see one where... Yeah, I like the ones at the start. So Smyslov was quite tall for a chess player, as you can see from the book. There's one where he's walking with his wife. I don't know if you can see it. If I hold it up to the camera, he's wearing some kind of overcoat. It mentions in the book, actually. So a lot of chess players were Jewish. A lot of Soviet chess players were Jewish. Probably still is the case, or Russian chess players, I should say, as it would be now. But obviously Soviet Union was not just Russia, it was also Armenia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, and so on. However, Botvinnik was a Jewish world champion. So what I didn't realise was actually a lot of the Soviet chess establishment actually preferred Smyslov to be the world champion because he was considered to be a white Russian. But as it explains in the book, he did possibly have some Jewish heritage as well. Anyway, I found that interesting as well because Botvinnik was always somebody who was considered to be, the doyen of Soviet chess, and therefore he was untouchable. But apparently that wasn't the case. I don't think there was anyone who was untouchable within that environment. Obviously the people that were close to Stalin and so on ended up getting bumped off. So apart from maybe Stalin himself, obviously later you had Khrushchev and some of these other Soviet premiers, there was nobody that was completely untouchable within that environment. I believe Botvinnik was also criticised for an interview. He was also maybe possibly got into trouble for an interview in 1983 that he made, where he made comments about Karpov. And the same thing happened to Korchnoi in 1974, as is explained in the other Sosonko book. Anyway, so we mentioned this, what I think of the book, which I would say this is minimum 8 out of 10, possibly a 9 out of 10 book. I didn't like it quite as much as a Bronstein or Korchnoi book, I must admit, maybe because the subject was less spiky, he was a nicer guy, interesting character, but different type of character, not so ego-driven. Is that as interesting? So let's see what the other reviews say about the book. that we see on Amazon. So I'm going to leave a link down below. So if you are interested in buying this book, please have a look. This guy says Elijah Logazar, who I believe actually is quite a strong player in his own right. Used to be friends with him on Facebook, but I think he deleted me. I never counted how many hours I played, but I could spend 8 hours or more at the board looking over Alekhine, Ilyakin, Capablanca, Tarash and Nimzovic's games. My father had roughly 100 chess books in his library and I pursued all of them. That's interesting as well. So that's why he became world champion. One of the reasons. I was thinking this the other day, that there were very few chess books that I read very much when I was younger. One of those books was by Danny King, called Winning with a Najdorf, and I really studied that really hard. So I think there were certain positions in a Najdorf that I could play to Super Grandmaster level almost. Well, not even almost. Maybe, you know, I would play as well as almost anyone. But I didn't study as many opening books as I did, you know. That was just one. So if I'd have studied like maybe sort of 9 or 10 opening books at that level, I could have became a much stronger player. Yeah, Sosonko was one of Smyslov's best friends. Again, you know, this is what I slightly query. Was it a journalistic relationship partly? I mean, I'm not throwing... obviously, Sosonko himself is the only one who can answer that. Well, did he pay these people? Because it seems odd that he's so close friends with, you know, 3 of the greatest players in history. But again, he's a very strong player in his own right and also a notable chess trainer. He'll probably like have a go at me for, you know, when I bump into him again for throwing shade. Anyway, yeah, get to know Vasily Smyslov. I regard Genna Sosonko's books highly. I have read all of them and really enjoyed the stories he tells about a great champion and grandmaster of the past. That being said, his book on Smyslov is very good, but not to the level of his earlier works, mainly due to the inordinate amount of space devoted to the match-fixing allegations by Bronstein on the Zurich 1953 tournament, which veers off into pages of history on Soviet intrigues that have very little to do with Smyslov. This material could have formed the basis of a separate book. So yeah, when he goes into this bit, which is around about the middle, maybe towards the end of the book, it does kind of seem slightly random why he goes into this, but I personally found it very interesting, even though I've read about it before. So I mentioned in a previous review about Mikhail Tal book that maybe it's not quite as interesting to me, that Mikhail Tal book, because I've read about a lot of these Mikhail Tal games before. So I think if you haven't read the Bronstein book, if you haven't read the Korchnoi book, this book is probably a real standout. But if you had read them, then you might think, well, actually, I've read some of this stuff before in some of these other books. The section on Smyslov are very good and give us a feel for the man. I just feel there was less material available on Smyslov, so Sosonko needed to flesh out the book more by including the middle part on match fixing. Smyslov appears to be a mild-mannered, gentlemanly type who didn't create too much of a fuss in the world and just got about his business of being a great player. There are no massive feuds like Korchnoi had with a number of people. Exactly, he's almost like the anti-Korchnoi, not a huge ego. Again, you know, it's very difficult to tell unless you actually meet him. I met Kasparov and he completely blanked me, and I thought in quite a rude way. I didn't think he was a very nice guy at all. Would I have got the same thing with... I imagine I would have probably got the same thing with someone like Kramnik. Would I have got the same thing with Smyslov? Possibly not. But again, it's difficult to tell. I met Bronstein, he was a very friendly guy, but he's somebody who liked to rub it on. He liked to have somebody to chat to, as is mentioned in the Sosonko book on David Bronstein. It's very difficult to say. But I don't think Smyslov was an insecure person. One of the similarities he has with Korchnoi is he did have some success as an older player. So around about 1984, it's interesting with Smyslov that after he became world champion, so he became world champion in 1950, he kind of dropped off in the 1960s. He wasn't quite as... He did play some games with Bobby Fischer and he used to play some strong tournaments, but he didn't quite have that. He wasn't quite close to becoming world champion. So it's interesting, much later in his life, when he was in his 60s, he qualified for the candidates final and he played Garry Kasparov. But as was mentioned in the book, he possibly wasn't quite aware of what a formidable beast Garry was even by that point. So Garry was born in 1963, so Garry would have been 21 at that point the match was played. I think it was at 1984 or maybe 1983, right? That match was played. I believe the Korchnoi match was played in 1983. I think the Smyslov match was played in 1984, and I think Smyslov was either 61 or 62 at the time. and he would have been 40 years older than Garry Kasparov. So it's quite a big margin to give away in terms of age, and unsurprisingly, Kasparov won that match fairly comfortably, having already defeated Korchnoi in the semi-finals, and he went on to play Karpov. Famously, the match was aborted after 48 games, so they came back again in 1985. Karpov had been 5-3 up, but Kasparov ended up winning the 1985 match. Anyway, so that's my review of Smyslov and the Cats book. So I'm a little bit hyper at the moment. Just drunk a coffee. Been watching a lot of Wimbledon. Even though I'm getting sick of the tennis by now. I think the final's going to be between Swiatek, an American player called Azimonov or something like that. But he sounds Russian, right? It's got a very Russian sounding name. Or Belarus or something like this. Possibly a family is from there. I think that's going to be quite interesting. Probably Swiatek is going to start the favourite. If you want a tip for the future, I think Mira Andreeva will win the Wimbledon title within the next 3 or 4 years. And I think she will win slams. Just from watching her play, she's very impressive. And I think for the US Open, you got people like Jessica Pegula, possibly an interesting outsider, and also somebody else I quite like as a player. Well, Andreeva, of course. But there's also, who else was I going to mention? There's another one I've just slipped my mind. Who's also the daughter of billionaires. So Pegula is the daughter of billionaires, right? But this other women's tennis player, I'm going off on a tangent now. This other women's tennis player. Let me look at the world rankings for women's tennis, right? Very, very random YouTube videos, as you can imagine. Women's tennis rankings. I'm more interested in this than I'm in the chess, I'll be honest. Emma Navarro. I quite like her as a player. I don't know why. She was crushed by Mira Andreeva the other day in the quarterfinals, who herself lost to Bencic. But yeah, Swiatek is obviously very good. But yeah, I think Pegula is quite an interesting outsider for the US Open, and also Emma Navarro, they're both daughters of billionaires. So I think Pegula's dad owns the Buffalo Bills, and Navarro's dad owns some kind of bank. So anyway, also I think Andreeva. So I'll probably end up backing about 5 or 6 for that, and then Sabalenka will probably win. Anyway, that was my review. Please leave your comments down below. Please like or subscribe, because if you don't, then my video won't get promoted on the algorithm. My amazing book reviews, and thanks again to Elkin Ruby Publishing for sending me these books, because they're very good books, and hopefully I look forward to more books coming out from this amazing publishing company called Elkin Ruby. Thanks again.